The house had always been my dream. Not that I wanted some huge mansion or an ultra-modern apartment with an ocean view. I just wanted something of my own. Something secluded where I could relax after a long day and forget about the noise of the city. For years, I bounced from one job to another. Electrician, mover, I even worked as a night security guard for a couple of months. All to save up a bit for a down payment. I was prepared to work for years if needed, putting aside every dollar toward my dream. One day, sitting on the beat-up couch in my rented apartment, I was scrolling through real estate listings. As usual, the options were either too expensive or located in areas where you wouldn't want to live, even during the day, let alone at night. But one listing caught my attention. A house on the outskirts of the city, right next to a forest, was selling for an unbelievably low price. You know that feeling when something looks so good that it immediately feels suspicious? That's exactly how I felt. But curiosity got the best of me. I jotted down the number and called right away. A man answered with a confident, almost overly friendly voice. He introduced himself as a real estate agent, quickly asked about my preferences, and immediately started hyping up the house. It felt like this guy could sell anything, even a rundown shack with a leaky roof. He talked about the house like it was a real gem. We set up a meeting, and a few days later, I drove to the address he gave me. The moment I saw the house, I knew. It was exactly what I'd been looking for. It stood far from the road, surrounded by thick trees stretching along the backyard. The windows faced the forest, giving the place a sense of seclusion I'd been craving. The silence here had a kind of depth to it, only broken by the wind rustling through the leaves. The house looked old but well-maintained. There was no sign of neglect, though it was clear it had been empty for a while. Without wasting time, the agent launched into his pitch. He spoke with such conviction, as if he was selling me not just a house, but a ticket to a better life. But I sensed something was off, and decided to ask why the price was so low. "So why is it so cheap?" I asked, glancing at the house, which easily looked like it could go for twice as much. The agent hesitated for a moment, but without losing his professional smile, he replied, "Well, here's the thing. A woman lived here, but she passed away a couple of years ago. The neighbors started spreading rumors. You know how that goes. But it's nothing. Everything's fine. The house is in great shape. We recently did some renovations. And those rumors? Just stories, nothing to pay attention to." His words made me uneasy, but damn, the house was so tempting. The living room was spacious with high ceilings, and even the freshly painted walls didn't look half bad. The old wooden floors creaked, but I liked that. It gave the place character. I walked through, checking out the kitchen and the bedrooms. Everything looked pretty decent, especially considering the place had been empty for a while, according to the agent. The renovation was smartly done, nothing too fancy, just simple and functional. Still, the low price and the rumors made me think twice. But even so, I had this gut feeling that this was the place I'd been searching for. Part of me had doubts, but the other, more desperate part was ready to sign the papers and call this place my own. I looked at the agent and nodded. "I'll take it." The move took less time than I expected. Within a couple of days, I was fully settled into my new home. Richie, my dog, was running around the house, clearly thrilled with all the space. He loved the place, and so did I. I watched him happily explore every corner, and at that moment, I knew I had made the right choice. Now I was driving to work, and though the commute was long, I didn't mind. It gave me time to think. to reflect on my life. I grew up in foster care, and to be honest, my foster parents couldn't have cared less about me. It's no surprise that I left at 18 without ever looking back. I bounced around jobs, making just enough to get by, until I'd finally saved enough to have something of my own. I'm 32 now, and finally, I have a house. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace wash over me as I sipped my morning coffee on the lawn, watching the trees sway in the breeze. The nearest neighbors lived about half a mile away, and I met them by chance. It was an elderly couple, Mr. and Mrs. Wilson. We crossed paths one morning while I was walking Richie. I saw Mrs. Wilson tending to her garden. She was short, with a kind but tired expression on her face. When she saw me, she looked up and waved. "You're the new neighbor?" she asked with a gentle smile, almost as if she was happy to see a fresh face. "Yes, I just moved in," I replied, stopping as Richie sniffed around the bushes. We started chatting. Mrs. Wilson was friendly, but I could tell something was bothering her. She kept giving me cautious glances as if she was trying to work up the nerve to tell me something important but wasn't sure how to start. I sensed the unspoken tension and decided to ask directly, "Is something wrong?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes lowering to the ground. She took a deep breath before speaking quietly. "Well, I didn't want to darken your move, but that house, it's always been considered a little strange. A woman used to live there. Thank God she's gone now, but she was truly mad, always dressed in filthy clothes, muttering to herself as if she was talking to someone nobody else could see." She stopped, as if searching for the right words, and I felt a wave of unease build inside me. "But the worst part is that one day she kidnapped our dog," Mrs. Wilson continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We couldn't find him until we went to her house. And you know what we discovered? She had cut off our poor dog's paw. He still hasn't fully recovered. Thank God she's gone now." Her words hit me like a punch. I felt a cold sweat form on my forehead. That day, on my way home after talking with Mrs. Wilson, I was feeling a bit gloomy. Her story left an unpleasant feeling, but I tried to push those thoughts away. It was all in the past, and that woman was gone. Or so I kept telling myself. That evening, I immersed myself in work at my computer, trying not to think about my neighbor's strange words. However, Richie wasn't acting like his usual self. He kept pacing in circles, leaving the room and then coming back again, like something was bothering him. I glanced at him, but too focused on my work. Didn't give it much thought. As night fell and I got into bed, Richie was still tense. I ran my hand over his head, which seemed to calm him down a bit. But something about his behavior still felt off. I woke up to a scraping sound. Thin, grating, it cut through the silence of the night. I grabbed my phone and saw that it was 3:30. I turned on the light, thinking Richie must have caused some trouble, but he wasn't there. I called out to him, but there was no answer. Sleep fled instantly, and as I listened carefully, I realized the sound was coming from the kitchen. I got out of bed and, taking my phone with me, slowly made my way toward the source of the noise. The scraping grew louder as I neared the kitchen. A strange feeling of unease crept over me. The noise was definitely coming from inside the wall. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, trying to figure out what it could be. Rats? Maybe. But the sound was too loud, as if something big was trying to break out. I leaned in closer, listening, and suddenly the scraping stopped abruptly. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing. Silence. only the faint sound of the wind outside the window. I stayed like that for a few more minutes, but the noise didn't return. Thinking it was probably just my imagination or maybe some animals in the walls, I started looking for Richie. I found him outside. He was sitting in the middle of the yard, his eyes locked on the moon. He wasn't moving, almost as if he was hypnotized by the cold light. I called out to him, "Richie!" He immediately turned, wagging his tail and running toward me like nothing had happened. He acted as though everything was perfectly fine. I brought him back inside, settled him down, and trying to calm myself, headed back to bed. Thoughts of dealing with this tomorrow swirled in my head as I drifted off, the strange unease still lingering. The next morning I couldn't shake off the thoughts about that strange scraping. I walked around the house trying to figure out what it could have been. The idea of calling repairmen crossed my mind, but then I remembered I'd spent all my money on the house. I couldn't afford any professionals. I'd have to handle it myself. I inspected the house, walked through every room, checked every corner and vent, but found nothing suspicious. As I stepped onto the porch, getting ready to leave for work, I noticed a letter by the door. Strange, I thought. Maybe someone got the address wrong? Especially since there was a mailbox right next to the door. Why not put it in there? I picked up the letter and examined it. The envelope was slightly worn, as if it had been sitting somewhere for a long time. The postmark showed it had been sent on October 10th of last year, nearly a year ago. In the top right corner was a stamp from Wilmington, North Carolina, and next to it was a red mark that read "Return to sender" and "Recipient refused." Those words immediately caught my attention. The address was written in neat handwriting. Rosie Lewis, 1725 Elm Street, Springfield. But what really shocked me was the sender's name, Grace Miller, the very same woman Mrs. Wilson had told me about. The crazy woman who kidnapped their dog and was known for her strange behavior. But as far as I knew, Grace Miller had recently passed away, and with no family left, the house had been taken by the bank and sold. It seemed like the letter had gotten lost along the way, and only now found its way back to the sender. Curiosity got the best of me. I decided to open the envelope and see what was inside. Opening the envelope, I pulled out a piece of paper written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting. From the very first words, it was clear this was a personal letter, and maybe I was never meant to read it. But something inside pushed me to continue. The letter began like this. "Hi, dear Rosie. How are you? I hope you're doing well. It's been a while since I've heard from you, and I've been really worried. Tell me what's new with you. How are things at work? How's your health? I hope everything's okay and you're feeling better." After these ordinary lines, the tone of the letter suddenly shifted. It's hard for me to write this, but recently I got some terrible news. The doctors told me I have cancer. It was a devastating blow. I couldn't accept it for a long time. The thought that my life might end sooner than I'd planned haunted me. I didn't know how to cope with it. At first, I was in despair, unsure of how to move forward or what to do. But then, I accepted it. At the hospital, they offered me treatment, but the doctors were honest, telling me the chances of recovery were slim. Still, I agreed. They said the fight would be long and difficult, but I want to try. Deep down, I hope I can beat this. I hope luck will be on my side. The emotions in her words were raw and painful. It felt like I could sense her fear and anxiety about the unknown. I'm going to fight, Rosie. I won't give up, though sometimes I'm terrified. I don't know how it will all turn out, but I hope you're doing well. Write me as soon as you can. I hope we'll see each other again. That's where the letter ended. I sat there, holding this fragment of her life in my hands, and a strange feeling started to grow inside me. Slowly, I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Her words kept swirling in my mind. Grace Miller, the crazy woman, as the neighbors called her. And now here I was, holding her letter, full of fear, pain, and despair. I closed the drawer where I put the letter and thought, could her madness have been connected to her illness? Maybe she simply couldn't handle the weight of it all. I felt an odd sense of pity for this woman. Maybe everything that happened to her, all the rumors, were the result of her personal tragedy. I tried to focus on the workday ahead, but the letter stuck in my mind all day. There was something wrong, something unsettling about it, and that feeling stayed with me until evening. When I got home that night, Richie greeted me at the door as usual, wagging his tail happily. But something was off. He looked tired, sluggish, almost as if he had lost interest in everything around him. It worried me. I need to take him to the vet, I thought, but I pushed that idea to tomorrow and went about my usual routine. It had been a long day, and I hoped a calm night would help me forget the strange events of the past few days. But the night didn't bring me peace. I woke up again to that same scraping sound as the night before. Damn it, what is that? I checked the clock. 3:30. The same time as last night. A sense of unease crept over me. I got up and headed toward the kitchen, thinking the sound was coming from there. But when I reached the kitchen, I realized the scraping wasn't coming from there. It was coming from the living room this time. The sound seemed to be coming from the floor, as if something was beneath it. Probably rats, I thought. But then I wondered, why wasn't my dog, who usually hated those creatures, reacting? I called for Richie, but he didn't respond. Silence. Probably out on the lawn again, I figured, and went to check. Stepping outside, I saw him. He was digging furiously in the middle of the lawn, focused and intent, like he had found something important. "Richie!" I called, but he only glanced at me briefly before continuing to dig, completely ignoring me. I had to walk over and pull him away. When I got closer, I saw that he had already dug a pretty deep hole, ruining the lawn. I started scolding him and grabbed his collar to pull him away. But then my eyes fell on what was in the hole. Bones. Dirty, old bones. My heart started racing as I realized they were animal bones. I shone my flashlight on them to get a better look. Yellowed with age, they belonged to a small dog, probably a mutt. I shuddered. These bones had been here for a long time, maybe years, but it was still unsettling. My heart pounded in my chest. What the hell does this mean? I thought. Trying not to panic, I decided I'd deal with it in the morning. Grabbing Richie by the collar, I led him back into the house. He didn't resist, but looked at me with sad, almost knowing eyes, full of something I couldn't quite understand. "Stay quiet," I told him, locking him in the living room. Richie didn't put up a fight, just continued to stare at me with that unsettling look that made my nerves prickle. I went back to the bedroom, but sleep had vanished as if it had never been there. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to close my eyes until dawn. Getting up early, I went outside to check the hole Richie had dug during the night. But the bones were gone. I stood there, confused, looking around the yard. Was it just a dream? I was sure I saw those bones, or did I? Returning to the house, I found Richie still in the living room. He wagged his tail happily, as if nothing had happened. He seemed to expect I'd feed him, acting like it had been an ordinary night. But what about those bones? Where did they go? I stepped back outside and Richie followed me, bouncing around joyfully. I looked at him, not believing my own eyes. "Richie, what happened here?" I asked, almost hoping for an answer. He looked at me like I was an idiot, then happily ran around the house. I stood there on the lawn, scratching my head, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't make sense of where those bones had gone or what it all meant. With a heavy heart, I cleaned up the lawn as best I could and went inside for breakfast. But the thought of what I had seen the night before never left my mind for a second. I got ready for work, but as I stepped outside, I saw the letter on the porch again. A dark, unsettling feeling washed over me, an echo of the previous night's events that still clung to me. Picking up the envelope, I looked it over and confirmed it was the same letter as before. The only difference was the date. This one was marked December 21st. A feeling of dread settled in my gut, but I opened the envelope and pulled out the letter anyway. It began the same way as the previous one. "Hi, dear Rosie. How are you? How's your health? I hope everything is okay. It's been a while since I've heard from you. I hope things are going well. I don't want to talk about this, but I have bad news. I went through chemotherapy, but the illness didn't go away. The doctor said there's nothing more they can do. When they told me that, I was furious. You understand, Rosie? I felt real rage, helplessness. Why can they live and I can't? It's not fair, but something happened recently that made me think. After the hospital, when I was walking home, I heard a rustling by the side of the road. As I got closer, I saw a dog that had been hit by a car. She was hanging on to life, even though she was on the brink of death. I looked at her and suddenly realized she reminded me of myself. I felt sorry for her, so I took her home. She was barely alive, but somehow she pulled through. And you know what's strange? I should have felt relief at her recovery, but instead, it made me even angrier. I started hating everyone around me for being able to live when I couldn't. Even that damn dog survived. Why can't I? I don't have much time left, and I have to find a way to live. Rosie, I swear I will find a way to beat death. I won't leave until I do. I hope you're doing well, and we'll meet again. I wish you would come to see me. I need your support so much." The letter ended there. I flipped the page, but there was nothing more. The contents left me both puzzled and troubled. Could the bones Richie dug up have belonged to that very same dog? But Grace had written that the dog survived. So whose bones were they? Questions began to cloud my mind like a dark storm. I had to get to the bottom of this.
Sam!
I placed the letter back in the drawer and headed to work, but the thoughts of that letter followed me throughout the day. During my lunch break, I decided to call the real estate agent. I needed to find out if Grace Miller had a dog. "Hey, it's Michael. I wanted to ask about the previous owner of the house. Did she have a dog?" I asked, trying not to sound too anxious. "No, she didn't have any dog," the agent replied, sounding a bit confused. "As far as I know, she lived alone. Why do you ask?" "Well, I've been getting these letters at the house," I explained, and I told him everything. He listened, then simply told me to ignore the letters and burn them. Grace had passed away on September 3rd, just over a month ago, and with no family left, there was no point in keeping the letters. I thanked him and hung up. His words left me even more bewildered. If Grace didn't have a dog, then whose bones had Richie dug up? Maybe the dog belonged to someone else. Or perhaps something much stranger was happening in this house. I tried to get back to work, but those thoughts wouldn't leave me alone for the rest of the day. For the next week, nothing unusual happened. Finally, I was able to sleep normally, and the anxiety that had been weighing on me for the past few days began to fade, dissolving into the routine of everyday life. It seemed like things were slowly returning to normal, and all the worries were slipping into the background. But that peace was just an illusion. One night I woke up again, but this time it wasn't the scraping sound. I heard whispering. My heart froze as I opened my eyes and looked at the clock. 3:30 again. That time had become something ominous for me, and now it was back, along with something even stranger. I listened, and yes, someone was whispering. My mind tried to come up with a logical explanation, but fear gripped me deep inside. I called for Richie, who was lying by the bed, but he didn't react at all, as if he couldn't hear it. Before, I could always rely on him. If there was an intruder in the house, Richie would growl or give some kind of signal. But lately, something had been off with him, as if he'd lost his alertness. And now, with someone clearly whispering in the house, my dog showed no signs of concern. I turned on the light and stepped into the hallway. Immediately, I was hit by a sharp, unpleasant smell of decay. It was so strong that I had to pinch my nose to avoid breathing it in. A wave of disgust and anxiety washed over me. That smell couldn't just appear out of nowhere. Thoughts of the bones Richie had found flashed through my mind. But before I could process it, I heard the whispering again. It was coming from the living room. A shiver ran down my spine. I took a step forward, trying to move as quietly as possible, though only one question filled my mind. Who or what could be whispering in my living room in the middle of the night? When I peeked into the living room, I found nothing. The whispering had stopped, as if someone had been startled by my presence and fell silent, leaving only an eerie emptiness behind. Anxiety washed over me. My emotions were a mess. Fear, confusion, and a deep regret for ever buying this house. Everything was just too strange, and with each night spent here, the situation became more unsettling. I felt a growing conflict within. On one hand, I had invested all my savings into this house and couldn't afford to leave, but on the other hand, living in a place where inexplicable things were happening was becoming unbearable. What should I do next? I thought, heading back to the bedroom. My mind was spinning endlessly. Maybe I should contact a psychic, or find someone who could explain what was going on here. All of it sounded absurd, but after nights like this, I was ready to try anything. I decided to think about it in the morning. I lay back down in bed, but sleep didn't come. I lay there in the dark, petting Richie, who slept peacefully beside me, trying to calm my nerves. In the morning, after washing up, I searched the house, hoping to find something that could explain the night's events. But as before, I found nothing. It was driving me crazy. As I got ready for work, I approached the front door. A strange sense of dread overcame me. I stood there, holding my breath as if afraid of what I might see when I opened it. It's just my fears, I reassured myself. But damn it, when I opened the door, there was another envelope on the porch. "What the hell?" I muttered, picking up the letter. I tore it open and began to read. The letter started as before. "Hello, dear Rosie, how are you? I hope you're doing well. I'm feeling much better, and it seems I have good news." There was an odd sense of excitement in the tone, as if the writer was in a good mood. But one detail caught my attention: the handwriting. It had become rougher, less neat, as if with each letter, her hand had shaken more. The first letters had been elegant, almost calligraphic, but now it was becoming harder to read. Maybe it was a result of her illness, but something about it unsettled me. I continued reading. I finally found a way to survive and beat this cursed illness. Believe me, I've exhausted every other option, but nothing gave me any guarantees. Until I found one woman. You wouldn't believe the lengths I went to find her. She lived in hiding, deep in the woods, far from civilization. I told her about my illness and begged for her help. At first she refused, but eventually she took pity on me and gave me a book. It was a terrible book, Rosie, filled with things that chilled my blood. I won't go into detail, but I'll say this. I want to live, and I'll do whatever it takes, no matter the cost. The letter paused here, as if Grace had stopped and returned to it later. The handwriting had become even rougher, as though the writer was in a state of extreme stress, or even panic. It's been some time now, and I've completed one of the book's tasks. It was hard, Rosie. I didn't want to tell you about this, but I need to share it with someone or I'll go mad. I did something horrible. The book said I had to kill puppies and bury them around my house. Yes, it sounds monstrous, but I want to live. I so desperately want to live. I went to shelters, found ads, and gathered 13 puppies. It was the hardest night of my life, Rosie. I buried them around the house, leaving small markers. I hated myself for it, but I did it. For life. I hope you understand and don't judge me. The letter ended with a plea. I haven't looked ahead to what I need to do next, but I'm already terrified. Please write to me. I stood there feeling a deep horror settle within me. Had she really done it? Killed the puppies and buried them around the house? This was beyond anything I could have imagined. Grace wasn't just sick. She was truly insane. I glanced at the clock. It was almost time for work. But hell, who cares about work? I called in sick, stammering something about not feeling well, and hung up immediately. Then I grabbed a shovel and headed outside. I had to make sure this wasn't real. There was no way Grace had actually done what she wrote about in her letter. But somewhere deep inside, doubt was growing. A nagging feeling that I was about to uncover something horrible. Stepping outside, I looked around, trying to figure out where to start. Grace had mentioned something about markers in her letter. Markers, I repeated to myself, scanning the yard. After some time, I spotted the first one. It was a large stone with a strange symbol drawn on it in something red, 3 lines crossing at one point like a Y, but with 3 prongs. The symbol looked out of place, like it didn't belong here. I froze for a moment, realizing that this was one of the markers Grace had written about. Gripping the shovel tightly, I began to dig. The ground was hard, as if it hadn't been disturbed for a long time. It was tough work, but soon I felt the shovel hit something solid. I dug with my hands and uncovered a small chest. It was old, wooden, with worn edges and rusted brass corners. I hesitated. I didn't want to open it, but my mind told me I had to. Slowly, I lifted the lid. Inside, buried in the dark earth, was a tiny skeleton. It was unmistakably a puppy. The bones were small, fragile, almost childlike, and a lump formed in my throat. I couldn't believe I was looking at the remains of something that had once been alive, breathing. It was true. Grace had really done this. My mind was flooded with fragmented thoughts. How could she? Why did she do this? I felt an overwhelming horror, anger, but also pity for this woman. She had been so desperate that she resorted to something like this just to survive. Clenching my teeth, I closed the chest and looked around. I had to search for more, other markers. My heart was pounding, but I knew what I had to do. I needed to find the rest. Walking around the yard, I noticed another marker near a tree. It was the same symbol, drawn in red on the bark. Without a second thought, I grabbed the shovel and started digging again. And again, beneath the ground, I found another chest. Inside was another puppy skeleton. Each discovery made my heart ache, but I couldn't stop. I felt the weight of the situation pressing down on me, draining my strength, but I kept digging, finding one marker after another. By the end of the day, 12 chests filled with grim remains lay around me. 12 small skeletons buried in this cursed yard. I stood over them, gasping for breath, overwhelmed by the horror. Grace had really done it. These bones were her attempt to cheat death. I realized that this was beyond anything I could handle. I had to do something. Shaking from exhaustion and fear, I decided to call the police. It was the only sensible thing to do, considering Grace's letters described her horrifying actions, and now I stood face to face with the evidence. Dialing 911, I stumbled over my words as I explained that I had found bones, that it was connected to the previous owner, and that something terrible might have happened here. When the police arrived, their car's lights cast a cold blue glow over the yard. 2 officers, murmuring to each other, approached me. They clearly hadn't expected a call like this. One of them, tall with a weary face, began asking me questions. "So you say you found bones? Tell us everything from the beginning." Nervously, I showed them the chests, now covered in dirt and dust from digging. Explaining it all felt surreal. I showed them Grace's letters, explaining how it all started with these strange messages and how I eventually found the buried puppies. The officers inspected the chests grimly, exchanging brief comments. They asked for the letters, took them for analysis, and spent a long time examining the bones, taking photos and writing reports. Eventually, they gathered everything carefully and loaded it into the car. "We'll be in touch once we have the results," one of the officers said, nodding briefly before they drove away. It was nearly midnight by the time they left, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, scenes from the day flashing through my mind like a nightmare I couldn't escape. The bones, the chests, the whispers. It all swirled around in my head, refusing to let me rest. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling as the hours crept by. When the clock showed 3:30, I couldn't take my eyes off the time. My heart was racing. I didn't know what to expect, but there was a tension building, like the calm before a storm. And then I heard it. Heavy footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if something huge was moving around the house. Each step was unmistakable, as if it was coming from beneath the ground or through the walls. I held my breath, trying not to move, but my thoughts were racing. Who is that? What is that? I lay there, listening, and with each step, it felt like something was getting closer. Then I heard it. A heavy, deep breathing. It sounded raspy, as though whatever it was had trouble breathing, but it continued moving relentlessly. The footsteps paused for a moment, and then there was a creak. I froze, blood turning cold. The front door slowly, with a groaning sound, opened. I heard something heavy step inside. What the hell? I thought. Panic washed over me, but my body felt like it was made of stone. I was paralyzed with fear. I could hear it walking down the hallway, its steps echoing through the house. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would burst out of my chest. The footsteps grew closer, closer and closer. I heard them stop right outside my bedroom door. For a few seconds, there was a terrifying silence. At that moment, I felt my mind torn between the urge to run and the inability to move. And then Richie, who had been lying quietly, suddenly tensed. His fur stood on end, and he began growling softly before baring his teeth, staring directly at the door. His growl grew louder, showing his teeth as if something monstrous was standing just outside the door. My thoughts were swirling like in a fog, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I lay in bed, trying to gather myself. What is this creature? What does it want? Fear gripped my body, every muscle tense. Richie kept growling, baring his teeth at the door, but I had no idea what to do. Damn it, should I jump out the window? The thought flashed briefly, but I was still frozen in bed, paralyzed by fear as if a shadow loomed over me. I waited. Time seemed to stop. The footsteps behind the door were heavy, as if something was carefully considering its next move. I braced for the worst, but then I heard the steps begin to retreat. Slowly, but surely, the creature moved down the hallway. Then, the front door creaked again. I held my breath, listening until I heard it close with a dull thud. The creature had left the house. Shaking from the tension, I forced myself to get up from bed. This was real. This wasn't a dream, I kept telling myself. My legs felt like jelly, but I turned on the lights and walked into the hallway. Richie followed me. Tense, his ears pricked up. I scanned the surroundings, trying to make sense of what had just happened. And then I saw them. Footprints on the floor. Large paw prints, like those of a massive dog or wolf. But there was one eerie difference. These prints weren't from something walking on four legs like an animal. They were from something walking upright like a person. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. What the hell is this? The footprints were clear. I stood over them, my mind struggling to process it all. This couldn't have been my imagination, I repeated to myself again and again. It was here. It was real. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. My thoughts raced around like mad. I sat on the bed, my head in my hands, trying to understand what was happening with this house. My mind kept going back to Grace's letters, her strange rituals, and her attempts to cheat death. Could it all be connected? Questions tore my mind apart, but there were no answers. I kept thinking over and over about what to do next. When morning finally came, I didn't even think about going to work. Work seemed distant and meaningless now. The only thought circling in my head was, how do I fix this? What is this creature? What is happening in this house? I had to figure it out, find answers somehow. I stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air, but to my horror, I saw another letter lying right in front of the door. What the hell? I picked up the envelope from the porch, my hands trembling. Everything seemed the same. The same old, slightly worn envelope with postal stamps. But the date was different. The date on it was June 15th. 6 months had passed since the last letter. What am I about to read? I thought, as I slowly opened the envelope, expecting anything. The paper inside was just as yellowed as before. I took a deep breath and began reading. Hello, dear Rosie. I'm sorry it's been so long since I last wrote. A lot has happened during this time. I'm ashamed to say I've done terrible things, but I seem to be getting used to it. It's a strange feeling. Doing things that once seemed unthinkable, but now they feel almost routine. It's as if I'm becoming someone else. The further I read, the more my anxiety grew. You know, Rosie, I think I'm going mad. I've started hearing strange noises, creaks, whispers, as if someone invisible is always around me. I don't know. Maybe it's part of the ritual and it's starting to take effect, but my goal is close. I can feel it. Recently, I had to do something horrible. I kidnapped someone's dog. From that elderly couple, remember? And I cut off its paw. It was necessary for the ritual. When they figured out I was involved, they reported me to the police. Damn old couple. I had to pretend I was crazy so they would leave me alone. I was afraid they might send me to a mental institution, but I think I managed to talk my way out of it. So far, everything is fine. For now. Now there's only a little left, Rosie. The ritual will be complete in September. I have a couple of months left to prepare, and I think that will be enough. This is my last chance. I don't know what will happen to me afterward, whether I will succeed or not. But I can already feel the sickness eating away at me from the inside. This is all I have left. Either way, I don't have much time. I hope I can make it and write to you again. The letter ended with those chilling words. A cold horror gripped me. I noticed that Grace's handwriting in this letter had become so rough that I could barely make it out. The letters were jagged and chaotic, as if carved into the paper, as though her mind was no longer grounded in reality. Something inside me snapped. I felt like everything was becoming too eerie and convoluted. I couldn't just sit and wait for the next step. Something had to be done. I decided to go to the post office to find out who was sending me these letters. Maybe it was some kind of mistake or a cruel joke. The drive didn't take long, and when I finally arrived at the post office, I quickly walked inside, hoping to get some answers. Approaching the counter, I explained to the clerk about the strange letters I was receiving and asked if they could check who might be sending them. "I'm sorry, but we haven't sent any letters to your address," he said, frowning. "We haven't processed anything like that." Those words hit me like a shock. How is that possible? I thought. If the letters weren't going through the postal system, then who was leaving them at my house? That question stuck in my mind. I pulled the letter from my pocket and showed it to the clerk. But he only shrugged and added, "If someone's dropping them at your house directly, there's nothing we can do about that." I thanked him and walked outside, feeling the anxiety rise within me again. What now? That question pounded in my head, and I had no idea where to turn for answers. Should I call the police? But with what? They'd think I was crazy. That's a straight shot to a psych ward. When I returned home, still restless, I decided to search the internet for information. Soon, the idea of contacting a psychic crossed my mind. I scrolled through ads and finally found a woman who specialized in cases like mine. I reached out to her and we arranged a meeting. The house I pulled up to was on the outskirts of town. It was old, with peeling paint on the walls and windows covered by heavy curtains. Wild bushes grew outside, looking untamed. The atmosphere was heavy, almost oppressive, like the place was hiding many secrets. I knocked on the heavy wooden door, and after a few seconds, it opened. The woman standing before me looked surprisingly ordinary. She was probably around 40, dressed simply in a long skirt and a dark sweater. Her face was serious, and her eyes studied me carefully, as if she already understood why I was here. "Hello." "I called you," I said, trying to hide my nervousness. "Yes, come in," she replied, stepping aside and gesturing for me to enter. Her home was small but cozy. Inside there was old wooden furniture, mystical paintings hung on the walls, and the air was filled with a faint scent of herbs. We sat at a small table, and I began telling her my story, from the strange letters to the footsteps I heard at night. The woman listened silently, without interrupting me. I could see her expression changing, growing more intense. When I finished, she sat in silence for a few moments, and I could tell she was frightened. "You need to leave?" she finally said in a quiet but firm voice. "As soon as possible. This house, this place. Something very bad is happening there, and you shouldn't stay." But how could I leave? This house was all I had left. I had invested all my savings into it. It was my only chance for a peaceful life. Leaving now would mean losing everything. "Isn't there another way?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. She looked at me, as if hesitating whether to say more, and finally spoke. "There is one way, but it's very dangerous." Her voice dropped lower, as though she didn't want anyone else to hear. "You need to find something that was precious to the previous owner. It could be anything, a personal item, something they were strongly attached to. You must throw that item into a river. The creature will follow it, thinking it's its connection to this world. If everything goes right, it will leave your house." I listened to her, realizing how incredible this sounded. It seemed like nonsense, like some children's story about ghosts. But then again, I had already experienced so many terrifying and inexplicable things. I was willing to try anything to be free of this horror. Thanking her for her advice, I returned home. A deep sense of exhaustion washed over me. I hadn't slept the night before, and all these thoughts and worries had drained me completely. Crawling into bed, I felt the weight of sleep coming over me like a wave. I drifted off the moment my head hit the pillow. I woke up from my sleep and immediately knew the night wasn't over yet. Is it that time again? A wave of anxiety flashed through my mind. I didn't want to look around, but I lifted my head anyway and froze in fear. Sitting on the bed in front of me was Richie, my dog, staring straight at me. His eyes didn't show anything, just a dark, empty curiosity. I was about to curse when I noticed he wasn't alone. 3 more dogs sat beside him. One of them, skinny and dirty, was missing a paw. "That's the neighbor's dog," I realized, feeling a cold chill run down my spine. All 4 dogs sat motionless on the bed, staring at me. The scene was so eerie that I couldn't move. They weren't growling or baring their teeth, just staring, and that was even worse. "Richie, what's going on?" I whispered, barely keeping the tremor out of my voice. My dog continued to silently watch me, then slowly jumped off the bed. The other dogs followed him as if on cue. I glanced at the clock. 3:25. 5 minutes before strange things usually started happening. Richie headed for the door. I was sure I had locked it, but it was ajar, as if someone had already been here. Richie turned, staring at me again, as if waiting for me to follow him. For some reason, sensing this wasn't just another nightmare, I got out of bed and followed the dogs. They moved quietly toward the door, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. I stepped outside after them and looked around. It was dark and silent, but there was tension in the air like before a storm. I noticed the dogs heading toward the woods, not looking back. Cold fear gripped me, and I went back inside to grab a flashlight. When I returned and shined the light toward the forest, all the dogs were already standing at the edge of the trees, motionless, staring at me as if waiting for me to follow them. My insides were trembling with fear, but I decided to follow. Stepping into the forest, I felt the trees cover me with their dark canopy. The flashlight illuminated only narrow strips of ground beneath my feet, and every movement of the wind felt ominous. Suddenly, I heard footsteps nearby. I turned and saw a shadow emerging from the darkness, heading toward the house. It's back. The horror pierced through me like a cold blade. It was that creature I had heard the last time. Its silhouette was blurry, but it looked terrifying. Huge, with long, unnaturally bent limbs. I couldn't make it out fully, but its heavy steps, its presence, it filled me with icy dread. I froze, unsure of what to do. Turning back, I saw the dogs still standing at the edge of the forest, watching me. They seemed to be waiting for me to follow. Trying to suppress the panic, I realized my only option was to follow the dogs and leave the house behind, along with that creature. We walked through the woods, and the darkness around me felt alive, stretching toward me like hands from the shadows. The trees' shadows twisted in the wind, as if something was watching my every step. The flashlight illuminated only a narrow patch of the path, but it was enough to see the dogs moving silently ahead. Their silhouettes blended into the night, and the only way I knew I wasn't alone was by the occasional flicker of their tails in the flashlight's beam. The forest was eerily quiet. No sounds of birds, no rustling of animals, just our footsteps and the crunch of dry branches beneath our feet. I followed the dogs, and deep inside I felt they were leading me somewhere important, to something I had to see. Soon, the trees began to thin out, and a clearing opened up in front of us, overgrown with tall wild grass and bushes as if long forgotten. The dogs stopped and began sniffing the ground, and then, as if finding what they were looking for, all four gathered around an old stone slab. I walked closer, feeling my heart start to race. The slab looked ancient and neglected, its edges hidden by moss and dirt. I carefully cleared off its surface and suddenly realized I was standing in front of a grave. On the stone, under a layer of dirt, a name slowly emerged. Rosie Lewis. Beneath it were lines carefully and lovingly etched. "You were my little star. Rest in peace, my angel. 2020 to 2024. My heart stopped. Rosie. This was the Rosie mentioned in the letters. She had been only 4 years old. I stood there stunned, realizing that the crazed woman who had written those letters had been addressing her dead daughter. Why had she done this? Was it an attempt to maintain a connection with someone she had tragically lost? Or was it her final grasp at sanity as she hovered on the brink of madness? All these questions swirled in my mind. But how had those letters ended up on my porch? And why were they coming to me? I looked at Richie, who had been standing beside me the whole time, quietly observing. "Why did you bring me here?" I asked him. But he just looked at me with the same blank, knowing gaze, as if saying, "Why are you asking this of a dog?" I stood there for a few more minutes, feeling a mix of horror and sadness roiling inside me. It seemed the dogs had fulfilled their task. Why this was necessary, I still didn't understand, but at least I had some answers. Deciding it was time to return, I started back toward the house, with the dogs following me. When we returned, I stopped at the porch and waited. I didn't know what to expect, but my heart raced at the thought that the creature might still be lurking nearby. After an hour, there were no signs or sounds of it. It seemed to have disappeared, as if it had never existed. I went back inside. Everything was quiet and the house felt strangely empty, as if all the sounds had left along with that creature. I took a quick look around, making sure everything was in place. The silence was almost deafening. Finally, exhausted, I collapsed onto the bed and passed out instantly, as if this whole day had been not reality, but a horrific nightmare. Early in the morning, I woke up, and the first thing I saw was Richie, sitting beside me, happily wagging his tail. I petted him on the head and asked with a forced smile, "Well, buddy, what will today bring us?" My voice sounded cheerful, but inside, everything was boiling. I got up, washed, dressed, and fed the dog, but my thoughts were far from here. I couldn't stop thinking about what might be valuable to this creature, what could make it leave, but nothing came to mind. What am I looking for? How can I find it? I knew the answer was somewhere in this house, and I had to search. Finally, I mustered the courage to open the front door. I had been putting off this moment, dreading what might be waiting for me behind it. Yet it was an inevitable step. I took a deep breath, gathering all my strength, and when I opened the door, there was another envelope on the porch. Damn it, flashed through my mind. It was inevitable. Resigned, I picked it up and looked at the date. My heart froze. The envelope was dated yesterday. How is that possible? With trembling hands, I tore open the envelope, already knowing there would be something terrible inside. And I wasn't wrong. Dear Rosie, sorry I haven't written in a while. I've been busy lately. Something unfortunate happened and I've been putting off this letter. You see, the thing is, some creepy guy has moved into my house. I don't know who he is, but I don't like him, and how dare he intrude on my property. And he's got this annoying dog. I hate that creature. My heart began pounding harder. She was talking about me. I've put up with it for long enough, hoping he would leave on his own, but I'm not waiting anymore. Tonight I'm going to kill him because I have every right to, don't I? He's intruding on my house. This is my home. This is our home, Rosie. I felt my body go cold. Every word dripped with hatred, and the most terrifying thing was the threat. Oh, and by the way, I forgot to tell you the most important thing. I've beaten the sickness. I'm living a new life now, and I hope, Rosie, that you'll join me soon so we can live happily together. See you soon. As soon as I deal with this guy, I'll write to you again. With love, Gracie. The letter ended, but I couldn't stop reading it over and over, each time feeling the growing terror inside me. This time the handwriting was clear, neat, but there was something demonic, sinister in it that I couldn't explain. These words weren't just a letter, they were a threat. Could this creature be watching me? Does it know I'm here? Thoughts swirled in my head, refusing to let go of the horror. I could feel cold sweat dripping down my neck, fear seeping into every cell of my body. The first thought that flashed in my mind, I need to leave. Immediately. I couldn't stay in this house anymore, knowing that something monstrous was literally breathing down my neck, watching my every move and preparing to attack. But how could I just abandon everything? All my money, all my efforts. This was my last refuge. I couldn't leave. All my thoughts and doubts came down to one fact. After everything I had gone through, I couldn't just run away. I knew I had to do something. Realizing that inaction would destroy me, I began searching the house for anything that could have been precious to this woman. It took the entire day, but I kept searching. Time flew by quickly, and when I finally looked at the clock, it was already 2 a.m. I had searched everywhere, from the closet to the basement. Every corner and hidden spot had been checked, but I found nothing of significance. Inside, I felt a growing sense of hopelessness. I could feel the pressure of time building. Suddenly, I noticed that Richie was acting strange. He was nervous, pacing around the house, occasionally letting out soft growls. It's getting close to 3 o'clock, I thought, feeling the fear rise again. I turned to Richie, trying to understand what was bothering him. Richie, what do I do? Help me! I said in desperation. At that moment he barked sharply, as if answering my question. It was so unexpected that I froze. The dog barked again, not taking his eyes off me, and then I realized he wanted me to follow him. Grabbing a flashlight, I followed Richie, who once again led me to the grave, the one where I had found the headstone with the name Rosie Lewis before. He stood next to the gravestone, barking as if trying to tell me something. I strained my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. What was precious to her? Rosie, That's the answer. It's her daughter. Everything suddenly clicked into place. I had to dig up Rosie's grave and throw her remains into the river. A chill ran down my spine. There was no time for doubt, though the thought of what I was about to do filled me with horror. I quickly returned to the house, grabbed a shovel, and ran back to the grave. Time was racing toward 3 o'clock, and it was already close to 2:30. I started digging, feeling how each strike of the shovel brought me closer to a grim truth. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. It was a coffin, a small one, as if for a child. The coffin looked old and modest, as if it had been placed there without much ceremony. The wood had darkened from time and moisture. I carefully pulled it out, my heart pounding like crazy. In that moment, I whispered apologies for disturbing the grave of a little girl. It was disgusting, horrifying, and utterly unnatural. I gathered my courage and slowly opened the lid of the coffin. But instead of seeing a human skeleton, I froze in terror. Inside lay the skeleton of a dog. What does this mean? Flashed through my mind. Everything had turned upside down, not as I had expected. How could there be a dog's skeleton in the grave of a girl? I didn't have time to process what this could mean because I heard Richie's loud bark. It was a warning bark. I knew I had to act immediately. There was no time for reflection. Closing the coffin, I started heading back to the house. 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, but the main point was clear. I had to complete the ritual, no matter what I had just found. As I approached the house, I saw a silhouette flash in the window of my room. My heart began to race twice as fast. I knew that creature was inside, waiting for the right moment to strike. I realized I had to get its attention and lure it away. A memory of the nearby river where I often walked with Richie came to mind. Now it could be my only chance. Holding the coffin, I gathered all my resolve and shouted, "Hey, I'm here!" My voice echoed through the dark street, and in that instant, the silhouette in the window vanished. Silence hung for a moment, but I knew she had heard me. The front door began to open slowly with a horrible creak, tearing through the night stillness. Finally, the creature stepped out into the moonlight, becoming visible. It looked like something straight out of a nightmare. Tall, massive, a dogman with a huge body covered in thick black fur. It had a long tail that slithered ominously, like a snake ready to strike. Its paws were enormous, with sharp claws that scraped the ground, leaving deep marks. But the most terrifying part was its eyes. Red, burning with hatred and madness, they drilled into me with their gaze. Its massive mouth curled into a cruel grin, revealing razor-sharp teeth. The creature leaned forward, its malicious eyes locked onto me, as if it was just waiting for the signal to attack. I felt cold sweat running down my skin. I knew, if I didn't run now, it would catch me. I turned and ran. The burning sensation on my back told me it was already chasing after me. I ran through the forest, feeling each step throb in my muscles. But fear drove me forward. Behind me, I heard the crunch of branches, the loud thumping of the creature's steps as it pursued me. With every step it took, the ground beneath it trembled, as if struck by a giant. I could feel its presence behind me, like death breathing down my neck. The forest trees blurred past like shadows, and the moonlight filtering through the leaves added to the eerie atmosphere. From time to time I heard it growling, that low, guttural sound chilling me to the bone. It seemed like it was going to catch me at any moment. I could almost feel its claws reaching out to grab me. Richie ran beside me. He barked and whimpered, as if understanding the terror of the situation, but despite his fear, he stayed by my side. I could hear his heavy breathing, and his loyalty gave me the strength to keep going. My mind raced. It's going to catch me. I won't make it. I pictured the creature looming over me, its claws ripping into my back. Panic tried to overtake me, but up ahead, I heard the sound of rushing water, the river. It was my only chance. The sound of the river grew louder, and with the last of my strength, I sprinted forward, swinging the coffin in my hands. The noise behind me intensified. The creature was closing in. I thought any second now it would grab me. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest. Suddenly, the riverbank opened up before me. I felt the ground give way beneath my feet, and without stopping, I hurled the coffin into the water. The splash was so loud that everything around seemed to freeze for a moment. But I didn't have time to look. I dove to the side, to the left, nearly collapsing into the thick grass. In that instant, a massive shadow shot past me, dark and menacing. I barely had time to dodge as the creature lunged into the water after the coffin. There was a huge splash behind me, and I heard something heavy crash into the river. The creature disappeared beneath the surface, carried away by the current. I lay on the ground, breathing heavily, panicked and in shock. Is this it? Is it over? I tried to understand if the creature was really gone, if it had drowned or simply been swept away. The river carried it away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Richie came over to me, panting, and looked at me with his eyes. Slowly, I got to my feet, still not believing I had actually done it. We had won, or at least survived the night. I felt the fear gradually leave me, but deep inside, there was still a lingering sense of dread. What if this wasn't over? We slowly made our way back home. The forest no longer seemed as threatening, but I still found myself looking over my shoulder with every step. When we returned to the house, the street was quiet. I couldn't sleep, waiting for the morning, but it seemed like everything was quiet. Did I really manage to do it? I thought with hope. Richie was happily running around the house as if he could sense my relief. His cheerful behavior rubbed off on me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the tension ease. I patted his head and then headed to the shower, enjoying the warm water washing away the remnants of the nightmarish ordeal. After the shower, I made breakfast and sat at the table with a surprisingly good mood. My phone blinked with a new message. It was from work, and with relief, I thought, maybe my life is finally going to return to normal. Deciding to head into town, I got dressed and approached the front door. Out of habit, I felt a slight twinge of anxiety, but I was almost certain that nothing bad would happen anymore. I easily opened the door, ready to step outside, but before I could cross the threshold, I saw an envelope. A cold wave of dread swept over me. Could it be? Is this really not over? My hands began to tremble as I picked it up. My heart pounded in my chest like it was bracing for an inevitable blow. I tore open the envelope and began to read. Dear Rosie, I'm sorry someone disturbed your sleep because of me. I've already returned you to your place so you can continue to rest peacefully. I promise that tonight I will finally deal with that scoundrel. This time, he will pay for everything. Dear Rosie, just hold on a little longer. Tonight, it will all be over. As I read those words, my hands went weak, and I dropped the letter to the floor. I turned to my dog, who was watching me intently, as if sensing my turmoil. I looked into his eyes and said, Richie, pack up. We're getting the hell out of here.